would like to welcome you all. Thank you all for joining. My name is Shamika Hansen. I'm an executive board member of the Long Island Progressive Coalition, also known as LIPC. And here at LIPC, we envision an equitable and sustainable cooperative society that is rooted in racial, economic, and social justice, where all people thrive and live with dignity. To do this, our mission is to fight for structural change at the local, state, and national levels to attain racial justice, build community wealth, and realize a just transition to a 100% renewable energy future. We mobilize Long Islanders through political education, grassroots organizing, leadership development, and the creation of cooperation, economic institutions to redistribute wealth and power. Cooperative. Sorry, folks. I am joined today by several other board members and staff, including Executive Director Lisa Tyson, board members Paul Merkelson and Luis Valenzuela, and all others will introduce themselves throughout the duration of this call. Today we are here to lift our voices and join the national conversation that has been reignited over the past few weeks. As we collectively mourn the loss of so many precious Black and brown lives at the hands of police brutality, we are now also demanding real change. That watery, light, watered down version of justice we have previously seen has not quenched our thirst. And so it's time that we collaboratively organize to demand, among things, that we defund the police. For some, the idea is scary, and we are here today to learn about what this really means for LIPC and its potential in the Long Island region. We know that today's conversation will be just a start, and there will absolutely not be enough time on this call to delve deeply into this topic, but we do want to work with you all to co-create a more inclusive and equitable Long Island where all residents can live and thrive. After a land acknowledgement and brief introductions, the discussion today will begin with some political education. We'll learn about the history of policing, why to defund and what it means, what are some calls to action, and then we will wrap with a question and answer period, at which time folks will either be unmuted to ask a question aloud, or you can type your question into the chat. I just wanted to give folks a quick reminder that we do all want to be respectful of one another and thus aware of what our community agreements are. And so you can see them on the screen, but for those who cannot, we ask folks to keep yourself on mute unless called upon, which I don't know if you have the option to unmute at this point. You should not. We will reserve the right to remove anybody being disruptive by any way from the call. This is a place to be respectful of one another. We ask folks be present by limiting other tabs that you may have on the screen to hopefully avoid multitasking, but we do understand everyone has to, live in your current reality and do what you have to do, so be as present as possible. We do ask for folks to try to hold as many of your questions until the end, unless they're clarifying questions, and again, remain to using the chat for them. We ask that folks try things on, such as new ideas, concepts, or framing, and we expect to have unresolved outcomes. So just to let everyone know, the call has started being recorded. So I do want to thank everyone again for joining us all today. We welcome your thoughts and opinions, your ideas, and we ask that you remain open in your hearts and minds. And I now invite Ryan to formally introduce himself and lead us in a land acknowledgement.
Hey everyone, my name is Ryan Madden. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the sustainability organizer for the Long Island Progressive Coalition. And I'm going to read a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. This is important when reflecting on Long Island, which itself is a colonial name. The indigenous name for this territory is Pamanok, Wampanoag, or Sewanhaki. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation for those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous peoples who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. It is also worth noting that acknowledging the land is an Indigenous protocol. The lands and waters of Sewanhaki, Wampanoag, or Paumanok have been home to Indigenous people since time immemorial. When European settlers arrived, Sewanhaki was an island already inhabited by Lenape and Mohican Pequot nations and kinship bands commonly identified as the Canarsie, Rockaways, Merricks, Massapequas, Matinecock, Nissaquags, Korkchogs, Secatogues, Ukachung, Shinnecock, Montaukett, and the Manhassets.
Awesome.
And I'm going to pass it to, our Executive Board Director, Sarika.
Great. Thanks so much, Ryan. So right now we just want to take the moment to introduce ourselves, and we're going to ask folks to introduce yourself in the chat. So if you can share your name, your pronoun, the organization or group that you might be representing, your favorite cell phone ringtone, maybe not, and maybe the community. So we invite you to do that at this time. And if you also feel comfortable, I'm going to do this in real time, is you can change your name on Zoom to include your pronouns. So that can be one way to also help us let us know how to refer to folks in the meeting. Great. Awesome. I see folks are adding in the chat. Really excited to see people from LIPC supporters to new members and folks across the island joining us today. And definitely continue doing that as we're going to move on to the next section, and I'm going to pass it to Nia to bring us to some political education.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Nia Adams. I'm a community organizer here with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. I want to thank you all for being here and taking the time to go through this presentation with us. And so we're here today to talk about what it means to defund the police and kind of a historical context behind that. It's incredibly important, especially in this moment when we're seeing the ramifications of police violence, and we are seeing people not only across the nation but across the world really mourning the lives of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade. So at this point of the presentation, we're just going to go through a little bit of history behind that, okay? I'm going to pass it on to Lauren.
Thank you, Nia. Hi, folks. My name is Lauren LaMagna. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a board member of the Long Island Progressive Coalition. I'm going to take you through a brief history of policing in the United States. And to be upfront, I'm going to do a lot of major broad strokes because there's a lot of history to unpack here. So to make it easy to follow, I've broken up U.S. history into about 4 major time periods, and we're going to briefly go over each. But the overall message that I want everyone to keep in mind is, the question that we keep on hearing is, how did we get to this point? And the reality is that we've always been here. We've always been at this point. It has just looked a little bit different throughout history. But for all of U.S. history, law enforcement has been enforcing laws that were explicitly designed to dispossess Indigenous lands and subjugate Black people in order to protect the property and quote unquote livelihood of the white elite. So to start off, from 1619 through the early 1830s, there were 2 forms of policing. One was considered watch and the other was referred to as the big stick. So the watch was a form of community policing, which was informal and communal, similar to how we see community watches today. And the other, called the Big Stick, was a private for-profit policing style where people got paid for the warrants that they served. So think modern day bounty hunters. Watch forms of policing were super ineffective. Why? Because people slept, people drank through their shifts, making them incoherent and erratic, more likely to put people at risk than to actually protect them. Community watch style policing today is still super ineffective and dangerous, as we see through the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. Now, big stick style was also commonly known as slave patrols, responsible for capturing Black people who escaped slavery or kidnapping freed slaves and returning them to slavery. In addition to somewhat formal styles of policing, we can't forget that settler vigilantes and rangers who operated both independently and in coordination with the US government were also forcibly removing Indigenous peoples from their land as a part of the colonial project of the United States. So some of these forces were the armed militias that were referred to in the Second Amendment. So these forms of policing and violence focus on policing the bodies of the other, and more specifically controlling Black bodies. So now that was over 200 years of that style of policing until we move into the 1830s. And it wasn't until then that the first idea of a centralized police department came into effect. And why is that, right? Like, what was happening in the 1830s? Urbanization was happening, and the emerging class of commercial elites were looking for a way to ensure that they could have an orderly workforce and an orderly way to conduct their business. So they began defining what was appropriate for public behavior. And this is when we get to see these public disorder crimes like public drunkenness, prostitution, loitering, and other kinds of policing of bodies begin to take place. Urbanization also kickstarted an increased economic inequality in the modern sense, disproportionately impacting free Black slaves and immigrants. And due to power and politics, the only way for people to fight back against economic inequality and terrible labor conditions was through civil unrest and riots, which was not what the merchants wanted, or the merchant class wanted, because it hurt their business, therefore their money. So that class of people needed to establish social control to protect, and at the same time, protect their image of elitism. So in order to do that, measures of social control were created by raising this idea of a dangerous class. So public disorder crimes were presented as actions of biologically inferior, morally intemperate, unskilled, and uneducated underclass. And now these dangerous classes were easily identifiable because the definition was created directly to target free Black people and poor foreign immigrant workers. So social unrest was presented as an individual personal issue and not the outcome of social and economic conditions. And we still see that today with the news media focusing on and calling people who participate in protests and participate in riots, referring to them as animals and savages, focusing on the what, right, the actions of the individual, and not the why the people are protesting in the first place. So the mercantile class saw the police provided a centralized group of people who were legally allowed to use force, extreme violence, or public disorder arrests to return order, to enforce social control that benefited their success. They were creating a bureaucratic policing institution that fit their needs because the people saw the police as the one that was establishing order, and therefore were not seeing behind the curtain and focusing on the people who were controlling the police. So they created this illusion, they created the illusion that the origin and the role of the police all along was to protect people from civic unrest and people who committed crimes, which we still see now, right, by citizens and people who want to become police officers because they truly believe they want to protect and serve the community by doing that. They created that illusion rather than having people see the reality that their actions were being controlled at the whim of those that have economic power. Side note, centralized police units had a slow start establishing themselves. But by the 1880s, all major US cities had a municipal police force in place. And what happened to kickstart that? The Civil War happened, and Black slaves were freed. Happy Juneteenth at the end of the week, right in the middle of this time period. And because of this, slave patrol vigilante-style groups evolved into those police departments as a meaning of controlling freed slaves who were now laborers working in the agricultural caste system and enforcing the Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow segregation laws. That was a lot in that time period. And it was a short time period considering the time period before that, right? So then we move into the late 19th, early 20th century. And police didn't get rid of those big stick style of policing, right? It just transformed into what we might consider today as like modern day corruption, right? An institution who answers to local politicians, protecting the interests of the people that paid them, engaging in deals where government services were traded for votes and political loyalty. They continued to protect and enable the interests of the white elite and continue to subjugate Black people and other people of color through extreme violence and enforcing discrimination laws. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just realizing in the chat that people are asking me to speak slower. I apologize. I will go a little bit slower. So we're now in 1968, in response to the, actually I skipped. So this continued, so, the subjugation of Black folks and other people of color through extreme violence and enforcing discrimination laws continued through the civil rights era, where protests, sit-ins, discriminations, and demonstrations occurred to fight housing and economic discrimination. So not so different from the 1800s and not so different from today. The violent responses to the protests, were similar in the 1800s also. So what was the difference between the 1800s and 1968 was that the violent responses and the violent responses to the protests were being televised for the first time, and it got people's attention. So again, it's not so different from what kickstarted the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, and again, not so different from what is happening today. So in 1968, in response to the public outcry against publicized police brutality against civil rights activists, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, President John Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and just social tension in general, large sums of federal money through Congress were made available for police community relations programs, which were basically a media-focused attempt to improve. I don't know about you all, but this sounds oddly familiar to what Joe Biden is saying with his proposal to increase police budgets by $300 million to reinvigorate community policing. Just gonna throw that in there. But anyway, we know that those police community relations programs didn't work because as we go into our last and most recent time period, we see the time of mass incarceration, right? The prison population really began to grow in the 1970s when politicians from both parties used fear and racial rhetoric to push increasing punitive policies. Nixon started this trend, declaring a war on drugs, justifying it with speeches on being tough on crime that led to the investment of the police and over-policing of Black and brown communities. That exploded during President Reagan's administration and again hit Black and brown communities the hardest. They were disproportionately incarcerated then and remain so today. From the 1990s through 2010s, we had broken windows policies or zero tolerance policing, which allowed for stop and frisk, and it continued to be over-policing in poorer communities, which historically are Black and brown communities because of the legacies of racial capitalism. The war on drugs also facilitated the militarization of the police force, where in 1994, a law was passed which authorized the Pentagon to donate a surplus of military equipment, including vehicles and weapons, to police departments, and drastically increased again post 9/11, where domestic police forces were given, again, a surplus of decommissioned military equipment and weapons. So this is part of the reason why you see SWAT teams being used used in increased frequency, sometimes just to serve warrants on nonviolent criminals or on people practicing their constitutional right to gather in masses and protest. Not to mention how investments into prisons, both public and private, create the need for criminals, which further increase the hyper-policing of Black and brown bodies. So that brings us to today. And I know that I talked real fast in such a short amount of time, and I appreciate you bearing with me. And if anybody has any questions or is like, I missed that whole beginning, can you follow up with me later and give me that info? We are happy to do that. But in short, the role of the police in the United States has been defined by economics and politics in the US, not by crime or crime control. The United States was built by free labor performed by kidnapped Black people on stolen Indigenous land. And the people that had the power to make that happen still have that power because of the institutions they built in order to protect their power, like the police. And that's my spiel. Next slide. And so with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Nia. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for 401 years of a history of policing. It is a lot to get through. So I'm going to do kind of a brief history and context about policing in Long Island, just so that we have, a more grounding understanding how that plays out here. So Long Island, which like the rest of the US is stolen indigenous land, right, has been purposely designed to exclude and disenfranchise Black and Brown people. We know this from how Robert Moses has designed the parkways, to the GI bills that excluded Black veterans, and to the startling legacy of housing discrimination, right, which continues till this day. Newsday actually just did an expose about it in November of 2019, I believe. So for these many reasons, Long Island remains one of the most racially and socioeconomically segregated regions in the country. And for perspective, that's why we have areas that look like Garden City versus Hempstead in Nassau County, and like West Babylon versus Wyandanch in Suffolk County. And when it comes to the police departments, there's a remarkable amount of jurisdiction overlap. So unlike the New York Police Department, which is a department that serves serves all 5 boroughs, which is 8.5 million people, Long Island, which has a population of approximately 4 million people, has approximately 75 different kinds of law enforcement agencies. And these are some of them listed out. This is not even including auxiliary police departments. And so that overlap can look like the fact that we have Nassau County Police, but then we also have Freeport PD and Glen Cove and Rockville Center and Garden City and so on and so forth. Police officers in Long Island are also amongst the highest paid in the nation. And in fact, there's such a startling difference in the disparities in which they receive that many New York Police Department officers apply for positions in Long Island. And this is particularly telling when we put into perspective the segregation that exists here. If you're interested in learning more about how this plays out, particularly with the law, I would suggest reading The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. It's a great resource for that education, beginning that kind of conversation. So slide, please. I'm that old to say slide. So what does this mean for Long Island? So in Long Island, Black and non-Black people of color, particularly Black and or Latino communities, are 5 times more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts, which are usually a result of a traffic stop. This is to put into context also that you're more likely to get pulled over in Long Island because you're more likely to be driving than you are in the city. And so how this plays out a little bit more is, for instance, in Suffolk County, Black people account for about 15.4% of traffic stops, which is far more than would be expected from the fact that they're only 7.1% of the entire population of Suffolk County. In Nassau County, my apologies, in Nassau County, for example, 70% of felony stop and frisk convictions involving people of color receive jail time compared to the 42% of white people. Although, if you can see from this graph, the population, the disparity is wild because 70% of the population is white. And actually in Suffolk County, the racial disparity in driver stops are so large that it's part of an ongoing investigation by the U.S. Justice Department reviewing policing methods of people who get pulled over, particularly people of color. Slide, please. So as we've talked a lot about the legacy of policing, and having conversations about defunding the police and reimagining what public safety looks like. We have to understand that incidences of police brutality are not isolated. So why we're seeing such huge public outcry really is not just because these things are wrong, but they're not the exceptions really. This happens all the time. And it's not separate from Long Island. It's part of the culture. So just this past December, in the first week of December 2019, a Black man by the name of Akbar Rogers was actually brutalized by several Freeport police officers in an incident that was also caught on camera by a civilian, just in the case as George Floyd. The only difference is that luckily Mr. Rogers walked away with his life. What is unfortunate is that at this time, I'm sorry, my brain got fried. At this time, the officers, and there's upwards of around 7 officers that are made visible in that video, which you can look for at your own leisure. We will not be providing that video here. Those officers are still policing that community, and that is Freeport is a community of color. So additionally, my apologies. The conversation we're trying to have is, why should our communities be hyper-policed while our students still do not have access to high-quality education and restorative justice? Freeport being also one of the highest need school districts in the state, and owed approximately $42 to $47 million in school aid funding by the state. So to put this into better perspective on how we invest in communities and how this plays out in the budget, I'm going to pass it on to Danny, who will express that visually.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Danny Hopkins, LIPC Communications Coordinator. So before I go down and look at specific county budgets for 2020, I wanted to show the broader picture. This is US spending on police versus welfare since 1970, and this is state, federal, and local. So obviously you see at 70, when the backlash comes, this big split where police, prison, and law spending skyrockets while welfare spending decreases. And that dynamic has happened locally, obviously, as I pointed out, but I just wanted to show the broader stroke, what it looks like, what it has looked like over the years. And the local budgets, the local police budgets also continue to grow, as you see here, like at a national and state level scale. So let's take a look at Suffolk County's 2020 budget. This is the source down here if you want to check my math. So this is the percentage breakdown. We'll get to the money next. But so if you look at it, Suffolk County spends 26.7% of its budget on police. 9.2% of its budget is on sheriff, 2.1% is on probation. So you total that all up, you get about 38% spent on law enforcement versus everything else. So what does that look like monetarily? So let's look at that money-wise. So police is $836 million, or 864 if you round up. Sheriff is $453 million. Probation is $68 million. So that totals $1.2 million in a $3.2 million budget, which is a wild number. So looking at in context with the rest of the budget, I'm going to show this pie chart. This pie chart is from the budget document that I did this math from, the 2020 budget document. So you'll see here that this number does not equal the number that I just showed you on the previous slide. That is because they do some weird math. So on public safety, or on police and sheriff, they split the numbers between expenditures and staff. So I'm assuming what they did is they put some of that money under employee benefits, but that's not why I'm showing you this pie chart, to tell you why they did their math wrong and tried to show you a weird distorted view of what they're actually spending their money on. What I'm showing you this for is because I want to show you that they spend 3% on health, 5% on education, and then 2% on home and community services. So just the shocking disparity between, so when we're talking about our priorities and why we want to defund, like thinking about our priorities, just sort of seeing what we spend, what our priorities are right now, and how radically just, crazy they are. So next I want to show you Nassau County. So here's a picture of Nassau County's budget for proposed budget, or adopted budget for 2020. So I did this a little bit differently because they don't use a pie chart when they break it down. They do use a pie chart, but it's not broken down the same way Suffolk County does. So here's Percentage-wise, Nassau County spends 25.1% on police, 4.3 on sheriff, 0.7 on probation. And then we get down here to see the Department of Human Services, 1.1%, and preschool and early education at early intervention at 3.8%. And I'm showing you this because I'm going to show you later the number breakdown, and it's pretty crazy. So let's look at what the police spending looks like monetarily, and that is $893 million on police, 153 million on sheriff, and 23 million on probation. And so total that up, that's $1.1 billion out of a $3.56 billion budget. So going back, so keep this number in mind, the 1.1 billion, and then let's go down here to our next slide, which shows you what we're spending things on. Police, sheriff, probation, $1.1 billion. Comparative to what Nassau County spends on preschool and early interventions, which is 137 million, and then Department of Human Services, which gets a measly 39 million. And what's also wild is that the Department of Human Services contains a bunch of these, the Office of Mental Health, Chemical Dependency and Development, the Disabilities, the Office of Aging, Office for Youth Services, and the Office of Physically Challenged, all that under one department that gets only 39 million versus 1.1 billion for police. And I'm sorry that I went so fast. We're trying to stay on time here. But next, I'm gonna throw it to Mike Haber to talk about why defund and what that means.
Hey everybody, my name is Mike. I use he, him pronouns. I'm on the LIPC board. So this section is about why we're talking about defunding and what that means exactly. Slide. So I'm going to start off by talking about past efforts at police reform and how defunding differs from reform. Then after me, Sarika is going to talk about what LRPC means by defunding the police. And then we'll talk about abolishing and dismantling the police, other kind of frameworks. Then we'll throw it to Benjetta, who will talk about alternatives to policing, and then Ryan will talk about how we transition. So that's just kind of an overview of this little subsection here. So let's go to the next slide here.
Sorry.
That's okay. I got a little fancy with my slides. You know how it is. So we remember Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and Rodney King and George Floyd, and I've been to protests for Keith Scott in Charlotte and Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and this is something that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. Police will attack or kill a person who's innocent, almost always a Black person. Protests come, politicians call out for police reform. There'll be differences in the details between what Republicans and Democrats mean by reform, but what usually happens is that police reform ends up with police getting more resources. The police do something wrong, and what do they get? Additional money for trainings, additional money for equipment, calls for community policing, which was mentioned before, which ends up kind of putting additional funds into police departments. And then there's bans on certain tactics that happen. People are now talking about bans on chokeholds, bans on no-knock warrants. And those are not necessarily bad things. Those things should be banned. But we've tried reform again and again and again. And the result is clear. They don't do enough. So in this moment, people are talking about other alternatives. So we're hearing about things like defunding, we're hearing about abolishing, dismantling, what do all those terms mean? So we want to discuss in this section kind of those different frameworks and why we're proposing a defund framework for Long Island. So defunding to us means that we want to go a step further than reform. The concept of defunding, it exists on a spectrum, right? And that spectrum is something that communities need to navigate. So some supporters of something called defunding want to reallocate money away from police to some degree, but not entirely. They want to divest from police departments and invest some of that money, as has been implied before, into other priorities: social services, schools, job training, housing, mental health services, opportunities for people. Other supporters of defunding want to go further than just a step or two into this big defunding box, but to bring it closer to abolition, where police departments are entirely stripped of funding and made to go away, and all of that money goes into social services and other programs that can benefit communities in a way that law enforcement seems to never do. So to me, what is important is that this defund box is a really big box, right? There's a broad range of different possibilities that can exist in this box. And so one thing that I'd like to see, and that I think other people with LIPC would like to see, is this is an opportunity for us to reimagine how policing works, to think about what's a better way for police to operate, how we could divest our tax dollars from punishing people and instead invest into things like education and health and other systems that actually help people. So I'm going to end with a quote from I'm going to end with a quote from, I'm going to end with a quote from I apologize, from not some radical lefty, but Scott Stringer, New York City comptroller, hardly a wild-eyed lefty, but he says the following: "If our budget is a reflection of our values, it is unconscionable that services for Black and Brown New Yorkers are always on the chopping block while NYPD's budget remains almost entirely untouched." So I think if that's a position that somebody as kind of mainstream as Scott Stringer can get to, I think we're already into that box of defunding. We're already kind of moving into a direction of what's a better way that we can move forward without every time one of these things happens that we just talk about police reform. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sarika, who will talk about some of the visions of defunding that move that arrow kind of closer to the abolition side of this drawing.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. So next slide. Great. And so kind of on not Scott Stringer, but we're going to be hearing from Angela Davis, who is a revolutionary and has been in the abolitionist movement for decades. And so this video will kind of just walk us through, right, how Angela Davis envisions and understands defunding and abolition in this current moment as being someone who's organized with the Black Panthers and been in this work for years.
To defund the police is, I think, an abolitionist demand, but it reflects only one aspect of the process represented by the demand. Defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. And it appears as if this is the rather superficial understanding that has caused Biden to move in the direction he's moving in. It's about shifting public funds to new services and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation. All of these things help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety, safeguarded by violence, is not really safety. And I would say that abolition is not primarily a negative strategy. It's not primarily about dismantling, getting rid of, but it's about re-envisioning. It's about building anew. And I would argue that abolition is a feminist strategy, and one sees in these abolitionist demands that are emerging the pivotal influence of feminist theories and practices by it.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. And so next slide. So right, we're building on the work and leadership of Black feminists, abolitionists that have grounded us in this movement. And I think something that Angela Davis really says around reimagining is one of the points that we're talking about here, right? Redistribute and rethink. When we, think about Rayshard Brooks, right? How could have that been a different story and a different ending if we had different systems in place, right? Where the police was not called and that he could be home with his daughters, right? So we're imagining a world where police at the end of the day are not necessary. Next slide. And this is just some more context as we're framing our conversation, right, from defunding, as defunding being a part of an abolitionist framework. And so this quote in particular is from Critical Resistance, which has been building an international movement to end the prison industrial complex by challenging the belief that caging and controlling people is a way that we must live. And I'll read this out for folks. So the prison industrial complex, or PIC abolition, is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. Abolition isn't about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It is also about undoing the society we live in, because PIC both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controlling of millions of people. Because PIC is not an isolated system, abolition is a broad strategy, right? An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us towards making our dreams real and that lead us all to believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. So I kind of want us to sit with that, right? That we're not talking about something that can happen tomorrow, that while calls for defunding might point us to steps that we can be taking, that abolition as a whole is a long-term goal, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. And to also really connect the work that prison abolitionists have been doing, right? Police, their jobs kind of exist to fill prisons, right? And vice versa. So connecting both the calls around police abolition, or police defunding the police, to also prison abolitionist movement. Next slide. And so this is a graphic that some of you might have seen being shared on social media in particularly. And this has been really from, again, organizers who have been doing the work. And this is where they lay out what kind of 8 steps to abolition, if you could think of it that way. And so one of them is really couched in, we can see defunding the police is a part of that step, right? And so I think this is where to connect, when Mike was saying, Scott Stringer has been saying to defund the police, right? That we understand that people maybe from different political spectrums can agree on parts of this vision. And then also to note that what does abolition actually mean? People get scared when they say, oh, we want to get rid of policing. And the question around abolition is, and as Angela Davis said, it's not about the negative, but it's like, what can you create instead of, right? What life-affirming institutions can be created in place of the system that we currently have? And so just to, for some examples, right, it's removing police from schools. And it looks like investing in care, not cops, right? So there's multiple ways that we can be thinking of moving away from the current system that is created. There is a amazing activist, Bree Newsom-Bass. She's often known as the young woman who took down the Confederate flag at the South Carolina Capitol House a few years ago. And she says that slavery wasn't abolished, it was reformed. Right, so when we think of how have we gotten to this moment, we've gotten to this moment because of reforms, right? Not because previous systems, as Lauren kind of laid out, right, the history of policing, how Nia mentioned around the history of policing in Long Island, we're working from often a place of reforms and not actually changing the structures that we actually live in. So next slide. Great. Cool. And I just this was the quote that I think kind of helps people ground in understanding abolition in general. And this is from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a prison abolitionist, right? That abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions, right? So this is where the rethinking and reimagining really takes us. Next slide. And this is just quick video that we wanted to really ingrain in us, right? What does defunding the police mean? I know a lot of people have come here for that question and are like, whoa, what does it mean? So this video is going to just help tie it all together around what we've been talking about so far. Oh. Ooh, maybe not. Cool.
You've probably heard this a lot, so we're here to explain. What does it mean to defund the police? It doesn't mean abolishing an entire police department, rather moving unneeded money away from their massive budgets into communities that need it. But why should we do this? So far, investing in police reform has not stopped abuse. For example, Minneapolis has already implemented a lot of police reform practices to help, but these efforts have not been effective. Yet police budgets get bigger every year, while budgets for public institutions shrink. This especially leaves poor communities of color with worse and worse infrastructure. Consider this. In 2019, New York City's budget for health and hospitals was just under $700 million, while the NYPD budget was nearly $5.6 billion each fiscal year. With such a large budget, the answer to every problem ends up being policing. Mismanaged schools, school-to-prison pipeline, drug overdoses, criminalize the users, unaffordable housing, imprison the homeless. Police responses typically don't act in the best interest of poor communities of color, so policing every situation leaves them either imprisoned or killed. So what would defunding look like? Well, three main things. One, divesting and investing, redistributing money from police budgets to areas disproportionately affected by poverty and lack of infrastructure. Two, investing in community-based initiatives. This helps grassroots organizations continue doing their long-lasting work to help local communities. Three, implementing non-police solutions to social problems. Know that this process starts with you. You can take action by contacting your city council and mayor's office, demanding to reject expanded, militarized police budgets, and instead scale back police forces to redirect funds into communities. Here's a final thought. Now more than ever, public institutions are in need of extra support. Would you rather your hospital have one extra ventilator or your police department have some more tear gas?
Great, thank you so much. And so that's really, you know, where our conversation is going to, and we see so many cities and municipalities across the country asking this question and also rethinking. And I'm going to pass it to Benjetta, who will go through what those alternatives to policing could look like. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Benjetta, and I'm an executive board member of LIPC, and my pronouns are she, her. I also recently retired from the Nassau County Sheriff's Department as a deputy undersheriff. I have a 35-year career in the correctional section. And despite my being in the system, in policing or law enforcement, I do see the need for rethinking and reimagining how law enforcement, particularly the police, should operate because of the militaristic model that was discussed earlier, and the fact that the training is really steeped in enforcing rules, not or managing people through the enforcement of rules. All of law enforcement operate from the same basic model. And when I think back on when I had originally started corrections as a recruit, my earliest recollection was from almost day one being taught about the othering of people. I was trained to see people, in my case, inside the correctional center, see prisoners as enemy combatants, and their whole goal was to take me out, was to kill me or cause me serious physical injury at the earliest moment. So it was important for me and my peers to be able to maintain that framework of reliance on my partner, following commands, and anybody who was not in uniform was them. So that was that us and them mentality. And that's prevalent, again, throughout all of law enforcement agencies. So when we talk about police and operating from that militaristic model, there is no communication between the community and police. It's only fear, distrust, and anger. And as it was mentioned earlier, a couple of examples earlier, it is very harmful to Black communities, and recent events shows us that that in fact what it is. So why don't we look at some alternatives to policing? So imagine if you or a loved one is experiencing a mental health crisis. So commonly what happens is the police are called, and they should not be the first responder because their training does not enable them to operate from a holistic or therapeutic approach to dealing with someone who is experiencing a mental health crisis. So we have a mental health counselor or some professional in a related field respond instead of the police. In an hour, you or your loved one's safe, and your consent with you have treatment, and you also have plans for follow-up care, which is public safety. Another one is gun violence in your community. So if you can imagine having a social worker or some trauma-informed specialist or street outreach worker respond to that community and working between the community and the police, they can de-escalate conflicts. That lessens the loss of life and limb, and it also, this framework would enable people to be connected to services that would address whatever the underlying problem is. One more that comes to mind for me is the proliferation of police in schools. And when we think about the biological and sociological development of young people, all of which we were once one, I don't believe that police are adequately suited to respond to the disruptions and conflicts that occur during the school day. So imagine if instead of having police and school resource officers, we use social workers, school aides, restorative justice organizers and coordinators and other supportive staff. Well, you would create an environment for children to thrive in where they would feel safe, where they can learn, and it shouldn't be based on their zip code to have these services. So I believe that there is no fixing of our current model of policing. We have to deconstruct it and reconstruct it in a manner that would be beneficial to society. Most importantly, I think that we should leave the police to really be able to deal with serious crimes and use other professionals to address the other issues. So I'm not going to read through all of these slides. They're up. I hope everyone's able to see it. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ryan, how we can transition to alternatives in policing.
Benjetta. Again, I'm Ryan with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. I'm actually our sustainability organizer here. So I do a lot of work around our climate justice and energy democracy campaigns. And one of the things that we talk about often in the climate movement is this notion of a just transition. And that's how we have to think about this move around defund and the larger context in which this conversation is taking place as a transition. Even just for some of the things that Benjetta mentioned is having the systems in place and the community mindset to support the transition from calling 911 to 311 in the community around the mental health crisis. Investing in community training for self-defense, de-escalation, and trauma-informed intervention. All of things that would require resources that we can take from overbloated police budgets and invest in these types of things. But the main takeaway is that we must transition and we must commit to building the alternatives together with the same social, economic, political, and cultural infrastructure that is currently prioritized for policing. Next. So I don't know if you all saw, but last week, Governor Cuomo signed multiple police reform bills into law, including Repeal 50A around transparency, banning chokeholds, prohibiting race-based 911 calls, and appointing Attorney General as independent prosecutor for police-involved deaths. As we've noted, we don't think that reforms ever go far enough. You have to attack the material infrastructure of these institutions and reinvest them into alternatives. But just to note, these bills have been around for years, but passed swiftly in this moment because of the momentum of this moment and the sustained action in the streets. So if people didn't see, Governor Cuomo suggested that protesters pack it up in light of these reforms, saying, people are still out protesting. You don't need to protest. You won. You won. You accomplished your goal. Society says you're right. The police needs systemic reform. Well, if you recognize that and know that our moves have been effective, then no, we're not going to go home. Especially as he himself has offered a longer-term plan under his executive order to reinvent and modernize police strategies and programs. Next slide. So this is just to note, this is the actual executive order, which again, we can share out, but it's a lot of text. So go to the next slide for a little bit of an abridged version, which essentially says that police agencies and local governments across the state are each being required to develop a plan that reinvents and modernizes police strategies and programs in communities across the state. And you know, they talk about some topics and that the plans will need to be enacted by April 1st. And the governor reaffirmed his plan to withhold state aid for localities that do not enact these reforms, saying that mayors and municipal leaders must engage with activists and community leaders to understand their demands. So that's what this beginning of that conversation for us today on Long Island. We want to co-create that with you, everyone on this call, the organizations you're a part of, the communities that you're accountable to, because even as Cuomo tells us to go home, he just set up with a tremendous opportunity to have our community response not only be what he set the frame for, but defunding and creating alternatives based on what our communities actually need. And I will pass it over to Farhana to talk about what we can do to actually move forward on this stuff. And just to note, Farhana is going to be mentioning a handful of things, and as she mentions them in real time, I'm going to post a link to those things in the chat.
Thank you, Ryan. Hi, guys. I'm Farhana. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the co-chair of the LAPC. So now that we know what defunding is, what can we do about it at this moment? Everyone at LAPC, we got together and we created this short list for you guys to help get you started. First thing you can do is probably the easiest thing you can do is sign our petitions. We created 2 petitions for this initiative. Nassau County is at about 350 signatures, and Suffolk County is about 500 signatures. So we definitely need to get momentum around these petitions. If you can, Ryan is putting the links on here. You can just sign it right now as we speak, would be great, and share with your networks. The next thing we can do is submit letters to the editor. I shared a little picture of the Newsday article, one of the Newsday articles that came out around this topic. To keep the momentum going, sending letters to the editor is a great strategy to keep the movement going. If you are a part of an organization, if you can, publicly call for defunding on behalf of your organization. You can also volunteer to lead the next steps to help form committees within LIPC so that we can move on together, get this going. If you would like to get involved, you can definitely send us an email. The email address is right here, administration@lapc.org, to get involved and get these committees off the ground. And the next thing we would definitely offer and suggest is looking for organizing one-on-one trainings, such as the one through the People's Action Network. They're offering some trainings, and we can share more information about that. And we also wanted to mention here that please consider asking your senators to add bills S-2253 and 654 to the statewide police reform package, which would protect gender nonconforming folks from undue police harassment. The last few things, if you would like to sign up for the LIPC action alerts to stay engaged on these issues, it's available on the LIPC's website. You just put in your email and then you can get pinged on any campaigns we're working on so that you can get involved. And the last thing, of course, become a member of LIPC. The more people join, the more power we have to make actual change. So we welcome everyone to get on, become a member, and join this movement together. I wanted to thank everyone for staying on till the end. We're almost there. I'm going to hand it over to Ryan and Danny. We're going to have a short Q&A session. If you want to stick around and ask your questions, we're going to leave it open for everyone to jump on and ask questions.
Yeah, hi everybody. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second to open it up for questions. You should all be muted by design, just in case we have trolls. But like, as far as asking the process for asking questions, please use the hand raising capability. And if you're uncomfortable with asking the question out loud, please type it in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Obviously, like once again, there's a lot of people here, so we don't expect to be able to get to everyone, but and like I'm scrolling through the screen too as well. So if I don't see you right off the bat, keep raising that hand. I mean, not literally, like the feature, or both, but you know.
Where would the raise your hand feature be?
So at the bottom of your Zoom on your computer screen, you should see reactions, and you'll have two hands, which are either, it looks like a high five or a thumbs up.
Okay, like the clapping.
Yeah, so clap at us.
All right, gotcha. I see we have someone with their thumbs up. Tim from Suffolk.
Tim, you got a question?
And I see Peter has one as well.
Yeah, okay, sorry, it said I couldn't unmute myself for a second. Do you guys think that cop watches, that's something that Long Island does not have, that the city has? Like when I go to protests there are cop watches, you know, obviously watching the cops. And Long Island has never had that. And I was wondering if you guys thought that that would kind of be like an effective means of maybe not transitioning, but accountability. And is there any kind of initiative for that?
Does anyone answer that question?
I can speak to that if no one else wants to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Tim, I would say that's a conversation that does not currently exist on Long Island. That's one of the things, for folks who may not be overtly familiar, cop watches are essentially like community-led, like from a like activist community organizer standpoint, not the same kind of like George Zimmerman cop watches, but actual like communities coming together to like protect themselves. So I think conversations like that don't exist on Long Island, and this is a space where we're generating ideas around different alternatives. If such a thing could be built up to meet the needs of crisis intervention and de-escalation, I think it would serve as a really good idea. And the more that communities are self-organized over determining their own needs, I think the better. So if those kind of things could serve as like models and kind of prefigure the type of investments that we're talking about at a more programmatic and structural level, then absolutely that's a good idea. And I'd love to hear from others about what they think about that.
All right, I do want to uplift a comment that Helen said in the chat. There are organizations who are watching ICE. There are 8 rapid response networks for this purpose. So moving on to our next, I'm going left to right in my screen. Alex has his hand up, so we're going to unmute Alex.
Thanks. I don't know how relevant or actionable this question is, because defund the police is a phrase that has really become established, and it's beyond anyone's control, really. I just wonder how effective. I'm asking how effective is it as a rallying hashtag, because it takes so long to explain, and it doesn't. When I first heard it, it didn't communicate all these things to me, that all these wonderful things that we just heard today, which took an hour to explain. But on the other hand, phrases like reimagine public safety or build communities, not policing, those seem to me to communicate it better. And I just wondered if anyone had thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. On Long Island, throughout our history, we always tried to rename things. We didn't call it affordable housing. We call it next generation housing, housing for young people. At the end of the day, what we know is we have to have a message. We're not trying to hide what we do. I mean, that's what the right does. It's very clear what we need to do here. Our path is clear. But to be honest, right now, we're seeing the world defunding. The rest of the country is defunding. We're seeing pieces of it happening all over the place. I don't think it's, you know, you know, I've heard a lot from people, I'll be honest, white liberals saying defund is scary and don't do it. And I've been attacked a lot lately for it, personally, my own family, I'll be honest. But we have to do what's necessary. And we have to, this is what the purpose of this teach-in is, right? When we understand what we mean by defund, and let's be honest, I mean, many of us want to see a world that we don't need police in, right? Like, that's our ultimate goal here. Defund is kind of in the middle. A lot of people feel a lot further beyond there. And so we as LFC, we are very committed to defund the police. We will not go back on that. We are hearing a lot of challenges on that. We are very secure. Our board and staff all here, and we think it's the right message for Long Island. And we keep hearing how conservative our neighbors are. We've seen thousands of people marching now. We've seen people who've never stood up before. We're not organizing, it's happening on its own. I mean, the people have spoken here, and now we have to help create the dialogue to actually defund. And that's what the governor, what Ryan said, the new governor's proposal. We have an opportunity to really change our police departments. And honestly, like, maybe we need to abolish the Freeport police. Like, maybe some have to be abolished that are just so racist, that are seriously like dominating and thugs on the street, which is what we see every day out here. So defund is not too far. We just need to define it better. And we need to have our message very clear of what we're talking about. It's really an intervention. We believe in early childhood intervention. We know healthcare, early, you know, prevention's the cure. Well, let's invest in communities that will solve so many of these problems. We cannot be silent on this anymore.
I'm gonna +1 that, Lisa, and just say, for me personally, if we're not explicit about the language, right? Which, by the way, defund is the official language of the movement for Black Lives, which is what this is all really being centered around, and who's been doing the work for years. It's anti-Black to not say defund the police, that I have to change my language to make affluent or middle-class white people feel comfortable with the fact that my schools are underfunded. You know what defund means when it has to do with schools. You know your schools are underfunded.
Yeah, one last comment here, and thank you, Nia, thank you, Lisa, is that, like, I think what we often tend to do is we always, like, pinpoint who we're centering to be like to reactionary white forces that are always going to be reactionary. Like, they're going to do what they're going to do. And I think the problem that we often come across in our movements is, or segments of the movement, is like trying to shy away from the real battle. Like, there is a war on Black and Indigenous lives. Defund is a pretty tame thing to say when people are being murdered.
And just one last thing is that now that, you know, so many of you have joined us for this, you know, really important conversation, like, you all now have the tools and the history to be able to have these conversations with the people in your lives. And you don't have to have a whole conversation about the history of policing in order to have a conversation to get someone to understand that what we mean by defund the police is that we need to have sort of like a budget justice, right? We need to make sure that the money that is being invested in our communities are actually being invested in our communities and the folks that are most directly underserved, because they are consistently underfunded, they're consistently overlooked, and are consistently overpoliced. So now you are able, you have the tools in order to be able to do those things, to continue these conversations outside of the people in this Zoom room.
Anyone else want to add anything else to that answer before we move on to the next question? All right, so we're going to move on.
there's a hand. I don't know if it's for a next question or a comment.
Susan.
Right. Susan, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go to Susan real quick.
Wait, okay. I just wanted to say that I think that when somebody is extremely sick, you don't give them the weakest dose of medicine. You give them very strong medicine to kill the sickness. So I very much agree with Lisa, what she said about, you know, and I'm finding that true in my community. The very conservative racist people, there's no point wasting your time on worrying about what they're going to say or what they're going to think, because they're going to be racist, and you know, that's what they are. It's better to concentrate on the younger people, the people that are not committed, the people that have questions. The other thing I wanted to say very quickly was I'm very concerned because I read in Newsday, you know, the proposals that people tried to present to the Nassau and Suffolk police chiefs. And it was the most pitiful reaction I've ever seen. It wasn't even a milksop. It wasn't even a piece of wet toast. It was nothing. My thought is that we really need to put some pressure there. And if necessary, contact Letitia James and ask that, because, I mean, that is a proof that from what Cindy's statement was, that's proof that they're not even dealing with the people on the streets or going to reform anything or reimagine anything. I think that Suffolk County is going to have to be one of the places where their funds are withheld. And we really need to focus on this. I mean, if people haven't seen the statements of the two police chiefs in Nassau and Suffolk, they ought to go back and read them, because it's a big red flag as to what we're going to face with them. They let us know they're not going to do anything, nothing. So that's my thought.
Thank you so much, Susan. If you'd like to talk for the rest of the 15 minutes, I would really like. Does anybody from LIPC have a question on that before we go into the next question? Okay, great. So I had a MZ Fitz 007. Working unmute. There you go.
Okay. Hello, it's Monique from Belport. I just had a question about going a little bit further as to getting justice for people who have seen their family members murdered by Suffolk County police, seen their family members brutalized by Suffolk County police, and I'm sure Nassau as well. So is there any support for that type of movement within either LIPC or whoever else is in here who is doing some of that work?
Who wants to tackle that question?
Mia and Justice for Akbar.
My bad, I was responding to Lauren. The question about who's doing that type of work on the island, was that the question? I was literally typing, replying to someone.
Yeah, that was the question.
So on Justice for Akbar, and you know, really exposing police culture on Long Island, we are moving forward with both organizing around that very specific event, just because, I mean, there is a video and it is very startling. And Freeport remains to be one of the most segregated and disenfranchised areas in Long Island in regards to housing, education, environmental justice, so on and so forth. That being said, if you want to engage in that work, Monique, I would be more than happy to speak with you in helping with that and tying that into the larger narrative around why we need to defund from the police and invest in our communities more, particularly our Black and Indigenous communities on the island.
So Nia, I think you missed it. So I think there's a piece about, are we helping to organize people who have actually family members, organizing people who have been you know, hurt by the police. And so You know, honestly, I don't know if any group's doing that right now. I think the question is how to engage with the movement right now. Like, we need personal stories. People do not think this is happening on Long Island.
Right.
Like, that's the reality. People think this is a city thing. They do not think this happens. Like Akbar, people were surprised about Akbar. We have to remind them because he's up on charges right now. He was beat by the police, and still those police are on the street, and he's still up on charges, this guy. The video is the same. It's the same. He just didn't die. But I think we want to help. We want to explore. Join us. You know, reach out. Join the Justice Now committee. And the question is, how do we support you and your family and getting your message out to support everyone who's been impacted by these issues personally? Because we need your voices. It's all about telling our stories how we move this movement forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us do know that this stuff is going on. It's just we know who knows and who doesn't know. Because if you live in one of these communities, you know that. So you know, that's one of the things that's one of the things that we are trying to organize here in Belport. One of the reasons, or one of the things that we're trying to put together right now. So if anybody is trying to support that, please let me know, and we could exchange what we need to exchange to, you know, expand.
Cool.
Yeah, let's connect, definitely.
Yeah, I have your email, Monique. I'll reach out.
Thank you, Monique. Let's go on to the next question. Julian has their hand up. Julian, unmuting you.
Okay, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Julian, they, them. I was wondering how I would get my story out there of the involvement that I had with my local precinct, and what would be the best place to go. I haven't heard the best things about, you know, going to certain newspapers or websites because they're, you know, right-leaning or left-leaning or whatever. What would be the best place to put my story out there without kind of just shouting it into the void of social media?
Does anyone want to take that question?
You're the media guy, Danny.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, does LIP's communication coordinator want to take that question?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question would, I don't know what the story, and I don't want to ask you the story because I don't want you to give a story that you don't want to give, but it just depends on the context of the story and whether the media would be interested, and you could do it with the media in a way that wouldn't be spun on. But it's hard. I mean, I would have to talk to you personally and then sort of develop from there. If we want to connect one-on-one, that might be a way for me to answer this question better and more specifically. I don't want to cop out, but just unless I know the details and all that stuff, it's hard to sort of strategize or to figure out a way to get that out effectively.
Right, I definitely be interested in reaching out, specifically because the people it does involve, including myself, are trans and gender nonconforming. And I think right now it's especially important to point that out with the Long Island, both Nassau and Suffolk police county police departments, and how that affects the local communities.
100%. And if we can, I'm going to put my email in the chat. It's going to come up as Long Island Progressive Coalition, but that is me. But please reach out specifically and we can figure something out.
And thank you for sharing that. It's really important. I think that's something that we really want to understand better about Long Island. And I think what's really important about LIPC is we're here to assist all the work that people are doing on the ground. We want to help prop up. We have a lot of resources. We want to help share our resources with you and how to get your voices heard.
Right, okay, great, thanks.
And it looks like we have a question in the chat from Retha asking if we're going to meet with, Lisa already answered it in the chat.
Well, I want to explain that because I think, you know, I was hoping it came out in the presentation. I want to make sure people understand at LIPC, where we think going at this point, where we're going to go as an organization, is we want to help bring people together to talk about the different police departments, whether it's Nassau, Suffolk, maybe, and others. We have to determine. And so we want all of you to join us to say, well, what does it mean to defund? What should we do to defund the Nassau police? What are those issues? What are we going to defund the Suffolk police? What are we going to ask there? And so we're going to need all of you to be a part of committees to determine those things and us to build power in actually doing that. Because I'm sorry, sign-on letters won't do it. We have to build real power. And we need to really decide what's appropriate. What does our police departments here do? We're not the same as the city. We have to look at our own communities. We have to talk with community members. We really want for all of us to be part of this process.
Yeah, in addition to that, like, you know, we certainly, I mean, we're the Long Island Progressive Coalition. We do a lot of coalition building and cross-island regional organizing, and like Long Island is a really complicated, large geographic territory, and the overlapping jurisdictions, especially for policing, and the overlaps between education is really complicated. And we're certainly not claiming to speak for like the voice of Long Island. That's why we want to bring more folks together around this, and also, but also name that like we're currently, from our understanding, the only organization that is publicly called for defunding on Long Island, and we don't want to be alone there. Like even language around divest is not defund, and calls for reform are not defund. And we really hope that this is a moment for people to like rise up and step up and not like be concerned about like what the backlash is going to be, because we're trying to build a fortified movement that like, or be in alignment with this like burgeoning moment that we're in the whirlwind right now, to be like responsive to what we actually need. So if you're part of an organization, you want to join committees, like want to like bring together the table that is going to be able to articulate this stuff and have, you know, figure out, because we don't have all the answers. We certainly don't.
All right, we have time. We're going to try to squeeze in one more question. We're going to take it right up to 8:30. I'm going to go to Kiana has her hand up, or their hand up, sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm using my cell phone, so I'm not able to do the adjustment of she, her, hers. But those are my pronouns. And my question in terms of, you gave us the numbers of how much Nassau and Suffolk police are spending in terms of their police budget. Is there a specific starting amount that we could request when we're making these calls to our elected officials, asking them to defund? Because when I suggest this, when I've been making my calls and asking for the defund, for the process to begin, a lot of the response is just, oh, okay, well, that's fine. But is there a specific number that has been thrown around that we could suggest? Or is it that the budget is just too large and there's too much that's encompassed in the police budget that doesn't allow us that language?
Who wants to answer that question in a succinct way?
Succinct way, there is no singular number, and we really do need to crunch those numbers and have people who can help us do that. And it's incredibly complex, again, because unlike the city that serves 8.5 million people with one police department, we have half the population, but upwards of 75 different kinds of law enforcement entities across the island. I don't know if that's not helpful.
No, that's very realistic, and that's just what I wanted. That's really just what I wanted to clarify. But I'm thankful, well, not thankfully, but due to COVID and my own organization's time availability, I'm happy to participate in crunching those numbers, because it's going to be a lot.
Awesome. I'm going to hand it off to, thanks everybody for giving your questions, and hopefully answered as many as we could. I'm going to hand it off to Shamika now to sort of wrap us up.
All right, so I just want to thank everyone. I specifically want to thank everyone who joined the numerous calls to organize and lead this teach-in, and more importantly, to thank all of you for joining us. conversing in the chat, asking your questions, and being here to start this conversation. Again, this is just the beginning. The work that has been done so far cannot continue without the passionate, active people such as yourselves who are here on Long Island. And so we would really like for you to join us at Long Island Progressive Coalition to help build our numbers and thus power. It's clear that the fight for justice and equality is far from over, but uniting our voices to act together for change is how we can work to achieve the vision of a more equitable society where we all thrive and live with dignity. So we ask that you all leave us in high spirits and motivated to take action with us. You will receive a follow-up email with the information that was presented in the teach-in today, as well as links to all of the calls to actions that were provided, both on the PowerPoint and in the chat. And so again, we thank you all for joining us, for participating and leaning in, and we look forward to seeing and speaking to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Good night.